Hello. Today I'm joined by Danny Dorling. Danny Dorling is a professor at Oxford. He's the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography. He's the author of many books: Peak Inequality, The Equality Effect, Inequality in the 1%, All That Is Solid, Rule Britannia. But today we're discussing Danny's new book. It's Slowdown, The End of the Great Acceleration, and why it's good for the planet, the economy, and our lives. I just want to ask, first of all, Danny, about the writing process. So how long did this book take you to write, and what were your sources of inspiration?
That was a long one. That book took me 6 or 7 years to write. Um, I was just playing around with graphs. I had the luxury of time to experiment with things. I wasn't necessarily going to write a book about this, but I was playing around trying to look at new ways, or what I thought were new ways of looking at change over time in terms of these weird timeline things, which the book is full of. And after a year or two of drawing these and working out a way of drawing them, which sounds really trivial, but the trick is actually measuring change from the date before to the date after the date you're interested in. And then suddenly everything turns into a beautiful, smooth pattern and you see things. And if you don't do that, if you measure change as people normally do, which is up to the point of time that you're interested in, you normally get a kind of jaggedy, random looking pattern. So that was the inspiration. It was finding a way of looking at changes over time, which seemed to reveal something. And then I thought, I better write a book about this, because you can't just play around if you're a professor with numbers and not do anything else. Then the nice surprising thing, I'd expected to write a book about that half of life that we're engaged with, which was accelerating, and that half which was slowing down. But every time I tried to find something accelerating, I couldn't find it. And suddenly I had a story. And the story was, we are slowing down far more than we think. Most things are still rising, or were, but not as fast as they were in the recent past. And something's going on. And that essentially is the story. That's the story of the book. And the nice thing, the other thing to say is that the book was finished in the very first few days of January of 2020. So I didn't have a clue about the pandemic at the point when the book was put to bed. It's all about slowing down before the pandemic hit.
Why do you think the slowdown has been so difficult to spot? Because the scholarship on this is quite limited. So there's Robert Gordon's book, is it the Decline of Growth in America? I can't remember the exact title, but
Yeah.
the scholarship's fairly limited on it. So why do you think, because the way that you present the data, it's really clear that we are slowing down. Why have
Yeah,
academics failed to spot it?
but I only spotted it by accident. I wasn't looking for it, so it's not looking for it. Across the kind of philosophical span of academics, you have those who believe that growth is good and carry on, we'll get technological change and so on. I have a colleague who's about to write a book called The Great Acceleration. In fact, I think he would have written it except for the pandemic. So you have that sort of set of thinking. But then you have people on the left who believe that you'll get a series of crises, that things will fall apart and then capitalism reforms and it falls apart again, then you get revolution. But they're into sudden change. They love sudden change and crises and really quick things. So they're not looking for a long, slow change. Then you have people who are environmentalists who look at a lot of the numbers and think we're all doomed, and again we need a really rapid change to save it. So there isn't a constituency out there who are looking for the answer being, actually things have started to slow down a bit. It doesn't fit a political group. It isn't, it wasn't something I was thinking of. And it was only when I kept on trying to get data sets so that I could produce some graphs showing what acceleration looked like and couldn't find it, that eventually I thought, this isn't just me. It is that, well, certainly my parents, your grandparents, both of our great-grandparents, lived through times of incredibly rapid social demographic economic change. And if you were to simply take the rates of change that they experienced and play it to your life. So I don't know, if you take your great-grandparents, you try to work out what would be the equivalent of the radio nowadays. What would be something as amazing? It would be hearing voices in your head. It would be a technology that actually meant you could hear voices in your head, but also you could mind read other people. I mean, that's when you turn these graphs into, I guess, a much more exciting way to think about it. Transport changes. You would have to have teleportation to see something as dramatic as your grandparents saw with aircraft flight. You'd have to be able to go to New Zealand in a minute, and you'd get used to it. We would work out a way of living with teleportation, but it just isn't going to happen. I'll try and think off the top of my head of what would the equivalent be to the computer. The computer was very important in my father's life. He wanted to go into computing. He's now 77. It was a dramatic change in his life. You've never, and I've never known a time without computers. So trying to think of something that would be such a shock as a computer, we can't even imagine it. I can't come up with my imagination about what would be. It would almost be like the gods coming down and from Mount Olympus, and you suddenly saying hello to you. That not quite okay, that's a bit extreme, but I'm just trying to get over a sense of how fast things did change. And although we try and talk about change now, because it's just the language we have is what's the latest fashion, what's the new inventions, it's so easy to be skeptical about what is announced. I think I talk in the book about a telephone, a mobile phone, where the screen would curve. You could bend it slightly because they just run out of new things to do. And you're talking to me now. You've got a mic in front of you. It's a nice mic, but it looks rather like one of those 1930s BBC mics. I've got a printer behind me, and it's great that I've got a printer in my room. But it's hardly. Oh, and it's a laser printer. And I can remember. I'm old enough to remember how excited I was when I was 22 years old, I think, and I saw my first laser printer 30 years ago. That. Anyway, I was trying not to be skeptical, but you kind of, and this way of thinking, before I started the book, before I drew these graphs and so on, I didn't think of things slowing down in the way I do now.
So the first sentence of the subtitle is the end of the Great Acceleration. So for people who aren't familiar with the jargon, what is the Great Acceleration? When does it begin? What does it involve? And what are the factors driving it forward?
Okay, I'm slightly vague about when it begins, so it doesn't exactly matter, but the longest you can take it back to is 1492. And many people, many writers have done that over the last few centuries. 1492, the taking of diseases from the old world to the Americas had a great demographic effect. The bringing back of silver, in particular silver and gold, changed the order of things in the old world. It meant Europe rose from being, a piss poor archipelago of Asia to a dominant position because China wanted silver. But that's just the kind of first teachings out of it, that the really fast acceleration is probably from about 1820 onwards. And it's most obvious in terms of population numbers. Population numbers doubling from 1 billion to 2 billion to 4 billion to almost 8 billion now. That's never happened before for human beings. It can never happen again unless we go to another planet, which we can't do. So it's an acceleration of our numbers and also the economy and many other things. And the other nice thing about dating it from the 1820s onwards is it fits, and I have it at the start of the book, I think, within the lifetime of Charles Darwin, who was interested in these accelerations in other species, because they occasionally happened in other species when there were 2 or 3 favourable seasons, when there was more for them to eat than normal, their numbers could balloon, like an algae bloom. And Darwin was talking about elephants. And there is, of course, a way this could happen again for human beings. we could have an almighty crash in our population numbers, and then yes, we could go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 billion again. But hopefully not. would be good not to have that. So the point of calling it the acceleration is that was what was unusual about it. It wasn't just that, if you just again take population as a simple one, it wasn't just that the population of human beings on the planet was increasing. It was that the percentage growth each year was on average increasing to reach a maximum of about 2% by 1968. So to have something going up by not just a bigger amount, but a bigger relative amount every year than the year before, that's like how a rocket takes off from the surface of the planet. You sort of see it hovering just above the ground for a fraction of a second, and then you watch it zoom up and speed away. It's a very temporary thing. Acceleration cannot go on for that long. But it is what our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents and their parents lived through. And the problem for us is that's where most of our knowledge comes from. It's what they wrote, it's what they think, it's their lives, and their norm was acceleration. And so we're used to talking about how the future is going to be so different because it was for them. But it can't carry on always being as different. And of course, before the acceleration, most people's lives were very like their parents and grandparents. The vast majority of people in the world lived in villages. They were agricultural workers. They lived in the same kind of dwelling as their parents did. Their lives ran to the same rhythm. They had to wait through various religious ceremonies before they could have children in the same way that their parents had. It was like groundhog life, kind of again and again and again, occasionally interrupted by wars and the odd other thing. But generally, you did things much the same way. You held the oxen or the horse and it ploughed, or you went round and round the well drawing out the water. And you can see this way of life in many parts of the world still, but it's coming to an end. There's a well in Pakistan where a friend of mine, when he was 10, used to take the oxen around to draw the water. My friend migrated after the age of 10 to Britain and has just managed to get the solar pump put over the well in Pakistan so that no other 10-year-old boy ever has to go round and round the well again.
Okay, so you don't take the view that slow down's a bad thing at all. You think it's something we can embrace. Now, you said about it before that we've been conditioned to think that speeding up's a good thing. So why do you think slowing down is something we should enjoy and embrace?
Okay. Slowing down doesn't mean going backwards. You've got to think about it like a car going forwards. When you're slowing down, it's when you put the brakes on and you're not going as fast as you were before. I think there are lots of simple ways of looking at this. The average family in Britain produces about 6 times more rubbish than the family they grew up in, which was often a larger family. So I thought about this with my family. When I was growing up, we had one small metal bin, and there were 6 of us, and we weren't poor. But every week we wouldn't necessarily fill that metal bin. Now I have an enormous plastic bin, and next to it an enormous recyclable plastic bin. Both of them are more than twice as big as that bin. Now, if we didn't slow down, then my children, when they had a family, they would be throwing away 36 times as much in future. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine how you could manage to do that. You'd be spending your whole time putting things in the bin. But slowing down, at its most feeble level, just means not producing yet more rubbish in future. To produce the same amount would be a slowdown. I'd actually like to see us produce a bit less. And there are all kinds of ways in which I think it's easy to say that slowdown is good. If you look at the number of flights people are taking in the world, they weren't just going up, they're actually accelerating. And people like me, I was flying many times a year. And it's easy to do. And you can imagine a future in which I was flying several times a week, which seems mad at the moment, But that's what continued change at a steady rate of increase would have meant. So I don't think it shows how much we hate the idea of slowdown, that we automatically think, oh, this is a bad thing. But the minute you point out what it really is, people go, yes, of course that's sensible. Why on earth would you want to have this enormous change in future?
And how do you see the levels of inequality being impacted by the slowdown?
I think they're likely to fall. I think they partly only reached the kind of heights they did over the last couple of centuries because of the acceleration, because of the change. If you go quite a long way back, well, it's go on forever on this. If you go before farming, you find remarkable rates of equality. So for the vast majority of human evolution, we've grown up under systems of incredible equality, whereby to survive, you had to not be greedy. And there are lovely stories of hunter-gatherers insulting the catches they made. So you might catch a kangaroo and you bring it back to your friends and you say what a terrible kangaroo it is, a crap skinny kangaroo it is, but because showing off material possessions are actually damaging. It may sound strange, but that's our evolution. That is what we as a species have evolved to live in, are small groups of people where you share, and where not sharing is seen as a terrible form of behaviour. Just like in a family. I mean, if you imagine in your family, if you were slowly stealing all the things in the house and putting them in your bedroom, it's only with farming that we began to see a rise in inequalities, and not necessarily that much. The vast majority of farmers were pretty equal. Industrialisation made greater inequality even more possible, then financialisation, to now get to a point where a few billionaires have more wealth than half the population of the planet. That's only possible with electronic money. If you were basing that on gold, it would be too hard to store that amount of gold, and what could you do with it anyway? So, that's a temporary thing in human evolution, that degree of inequality. But also, it's possible to sell inequality to people if you're having rising consumption overall. So if each generation is getting more than the generation before them, you can tell people, don't worry about the fact that those people up on the hill have got 5 sports cars and a swimming pool. You just wait and your children will get that. Now, that isn't possible under a slowdown. People will stop believing you that it's okay, their children will be better off in future, because they can see they won't. And inequality becomes far more important.
You make an interesting claim about education. So you say that eventually student debt will be a thing of the past. Now, how do you think the university and education more broadly is going to be impacted by the slowdown?
Student debts are remarkably recent. They didn't exist for me. All my parents who went to university, I've got at least one grandparent who went. Very recent. Really big student debts we've only had in the UK for 8 years. It's amazing how people think they're there forever. It's only been 8 years since that really nasty, evil £9,000 a year, thanks to Tony Blair, came in. Most of Europe has almost no debts. Most of the world doesn't have student debt. You go to university like you go for school. Of course, you don't pay. It's seen as anathema, and it's a ridiculous situation. In decent countries in the world, you don't pay for school meals. You just have a meal. It's at school. It's not called a school meal. It's just a meal. Just like you don't pay for your chair and your desk at school. Now, there are stupid people who'd like people to pay for their chair and desk at school, and who also like student debt. And they're just stupid. And I've lost my patience over having arguments with them. I think it's just such an extreme of stupidity, this idea that we can find a way to make people take out an enormous loan on a lie that, don't you worry, we'll keep inequality going in the future, so that graduates are paid so much more than other people that you'll be able to repay this loan. But you want to go to university because you don't want to be a skivvy, because if you don't go to university, you'll have a really crap job and you'll get no money. So take out this loan and you'll be rich. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk kind of thing, except, it's just stupid. It's just immensely stupid. And it shows what you can get away with. And you've got to remember this, and it's partly because what else do people do? What do you do when half the population go to university and you're told if you don't go, you're stuck? Why make it £9,000 a year? We could make it 20 or 30. Yeah, I mean, why make it so that just you pay the loan off? Make it so your children do as well, couldn't we? Because I'd like to get paid £1 million a year as a professor. I don't know. I've lost my patience with the student loan argument. I mean, okay, it was just stupid. I mean, it was.
Well, the argument goes, doesn't it, that more people are going than ever, and therefore it's a necessary payment.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Don't be stupid. As I honestly say to people who argue for it, what happened to you in your education that made you so thick that you can't get what a stupid argument is? And very often they had very privileged educations, people who argue for student loans. You could have said the same with the ragged schools when we first introduced elementary schools. You could have said, we need some money for those. We can't possibly afford to have people going to elementary schools. It's going to cost a fortune. What if the entire population learned to read or write? You never know what might happen next. What do you say to those people? You say, look at the rest of Europe. So I stopped myself swearing there. Yeah, look at Germany. Look at overseas students in Germany. How much do they pay? Almost nothing. How many are there? More than in the UK. But the UK system is really clever, because if we charge people from overseas a fortune, then the country will make an absolute fortune, and we can base our universities and finance them on overseas students, particularly from China, because that's a really clever idea. That'll make them really stable. That's brilliant, isn't it? Absolutely, rocket science. That was so clever. Now look at the University of London, look at Bristol, look at Warwick, look at Sheffield. Look what's happening now. I don't think COVID was a message from God, particularly for the people in favour of student loans and high international fees, but it was just bad. The minute you pay for education, it stops being education. The minute you're paying for it, it becomes fake. All I have to, if you pay me to provide you education, all I've got to do is convince you you're getting an education. And the best way to do that is I give you lots of A's, loads of them. I write 73 on your essay. Well done. What a genius you are. Come back next week. Pass you. And whenever you look at education in Britain, the people who pay for it don't ever fail, because you're not going to pay for something you fail. Doesn't mean they've learned anything. Doesn't mean they're clever. Just means they don't fail. And if you compare our cohorts of young people to cohorts in parts of Europe where they still have proper education, they can do so much more. They're so better at doing stuff, learning, like not just languages, like 6 or 7 or 8 languages in some cases. The average 18-year-old in Finland is about 6 languages. Computer programming, mathematics. But we in Britain, we have the most expensive education system in Europe. We have the biggest number of private schools. And what does it produce? Prime Minister who could do a tiny bit of Greek. It's pathetic. I don't know. I've got old and cynical, but I've lost my patience. I made these arguments, the last sort of decade more politely. I just think there comes a time when you've just got to say bluntly to people who are trying to argue for these things, please just think about what you're saying, because it's not a fair debate. It's too easy. Don't do it. I mean, there'll be complicated things to debate about, but the idea that it's a good idea to charge people to go to university, and without any realizing what that would create, what that would get you, how that corrupts the whole situation, and this army of young people with their 2 wands. It's kind of sad for them and their parents. It's a great swindle. 3 years to all first. And we could carry on like this. Normal growth. This is why Slowdown's good. In the past, most years, nobody would get a first, say in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. There might occasionally be one first-class degree. So most people would get a lower second-class degree or third. But people get upset if they don't get high degree results. Well, that's easy to solve. All you do is increase the proportions. You can give a third of people a first now, almost everybody else a 2-1. If you hardly turn up, you get a 2-2. And not slowing down would mean that we would have start first, and if you've done really badly and you're really lazy, in 10 or 15 years' time, you get a first without a start. And that's the silliness. And it's not hard to see. Now, I don't think it's necessarily that helpful to actually divide people up and tell somebody when they're 21, oh, you're a genius, here's your special number, anyway. But the English particular method of doing things was a bit like the American. I'll give you another example. We often get American visiting students. And very often, and these are master's students, very often they say they've done calculus because they call it calculus in the States. And I quite often ask them, what was calculus? What did they actually do? And in the majority of cases, they say they can't remember, but they've done calculus. But they don't even know what calculus was. And that's a sad indictment of kind of extreme educational inequality. Oh, last example I'll give you. Somebody I know quite well, quite young, was sent to a very expensive school, only about 12 or 13, said they got 98% in maths. And my mum said to them, well, that's great. What does 98% mean? They said, I don't know, but I've got it in maths. And everybody says, well done when I tell them. Okay, you get the idea of, yeah. And so the sad thing is that we're still in a case in Britain of people not realising that private education is bad. And so you have state education trying to emulate it, which is like emulating crufts. It's emulating getting dogs to jump through hoops in a particular way, where they do the things to give you 98%, but they don't know what 98% means. Lack of imagination, constant competition, doing what you're told, rather than using your own mind and being imaginative. And if you're not imaginative, it's so massively limiting in what you can actually do. Try and write a book without imagination. Really, it's impossible. So you've got to look at what is it that encourages imagination. And it isn't thinking that you're better than everybody else. And how can you get on with other people or understand other people? Well, not by thinking you're better than them. It doesn't help.
So you've mentioned the pandemic once, and you do talk about epidemics and pandemics in the book. So how's COVID-19 is it gonna be a catalyst for the slowdown, or is it gonna have no effect really?
It's interesting. It could have no effect. I mean, that would be the clever money, because you got to go back to 1665 for a pandemic which had the effect of the Black Death and rising value of labour, or 1492 in the Americas. That the past 4 or 5 flu pandemics had almost no effect. Well, most spectacularly, the 1957 flu pandemic. In the middle of it, the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, told the population they'd never had it so good and got away with it. And he's remembered for that in the middle of a flu pandemic, which killed at the same rate as COVID-19. The huge difference, and something's changed, and it would have been very hard to predict it. The huge difference is that we stopped. We deliberately chose to slow down. And we'd never done that before. We had when I say we, it's an American model. There's an American model on the book, there's a manual saying what to do if a event that was as bad or worse as the 1918 pandemic came along. And that had flattened the curve in it and so on. And we sort of applied that, but it was China first controlling it. And that was unpredictable. And it's the economic effects and social effects of this, which is the reason why it could be a catalyst and it could change things. We could just have written it through. We're not entirely sure how many people have died. It probably wouldn't have been 500,000 in Britain. Worldwide, the number of people who died so far is 500,000, which is, of everybody who's died, and we're talking in July, so first half of 2020, 1 in 60 people in the world who've died have died of COVID-19. 59 out of 60 have died of something else. Most people in Britain who've died in the first half of this not died of COVID-19. Your chance of dying at your age is practically zero. I've yet to find a report of a single student in Europe who's died of COVID-19. There has to be one. On the other hand, if you look at the biggest rises in deaths between years since we started recording them about 1830, this is the 5th biggest rise in deaths in 180 years in the UK. So it's big. But I think it's this incredible change to, we are not willing to sacrifice the lives of old people anymore. And in the past, it's a mixture of we didn't know what to do. There were far fewer elderly people. There was no 24-hour news. But something's changed fundamentally. So, you know, you're far more likely to die crossing the road going into a shop than actually from getting COVID. I am, and I'm 52. But still, we've got to wear a mask in the shop. But the cars are allowed to go at 30 miles an hour on the road outside, because that's the thing we're used to after 20. Yeah, so personally, I think this could be the catalyst. Partly when I wrote Peak Inequality, that was called Peak Inequality because there was things suggesting that we were on a change then anyway. And so people always find catalysts in hindsight. A similar period, the last big peak in inequality was 1913 to 1918. And we can't know whether the catalyst was the First World War or the Russian Revolution, or not inconceivably the flu pandemic. We don't know. But there was so much going on then, but that's when things changed. We were at a peak of what was possible in terms of how much the rich could take round about now anyway, because the upper middle class were doing very badly compared to the millionaires. We were at various ecological limits. We had school strikes, we had Greta, we had a global recession that we were walking into. We had trade wars beginning, all before this hit. But what the pandemic does is it changes things, such as the economics of air flight. You know, even when the aircraft begin to fly again, the actual cost of a ticket should be hopefully double what it was before. And that changes whether people will fly, as well as how safe they feel flying, how much they worry about doing something which actually turns out to be quite dangerous. The risk of flying was never crashing. That risk is absolutely tiny. The risk is what's on the lock on the toilet door, because everybody touches the lock on the toilet door on the plane. And it isn't just that you're in a confined space with another set of people for those hours. It's that you're in a confined space with a special set of people who can afford to travel. And those are the people who are most likely to have COVID-19. It's Chinese tourists, it's Italian skiers, it's politicians. So it makes sense to not get on a plane. It's fine to walk into a shop without a mask, but for God's sake, don't get on an aeroplane. If you're worried about these things, it's the most risky. And that can change the economies. But also, people have learned they can buy less, and also people may worry about saving more. So we're on a spiral down economically. There are predictions of 6 million unemployed in Britain by Christmas. You either let that happen or you create jobs. government jobs. Now, this government doesn't want to do that, but it also doesn't want 6 million unemployed young people because they might not like what's happening. So I think this is the biggest event since the Second World War, and it will inevitably be said to be a catalyst. It may be overemphasized how much was due to COVID and how much was actually on the cards anyway. I think the Johnson government was an extreme government for a Conservative administration to produce. So this is for the UK. Cameron was a normal Conservative government, and he had the pick of ministers. Theresa May couldn't pick the ones that Cameron had because they're loyal to him, so she had to pick another set of ministers. And that left the least competent MPs to be Johnson's ministers. And they also had the sign of things, then they did whatever he said. So we had a spectacularly incompetent government, and Brexit, and all other crises about to occur before COVID. And it's that kind of incompetence. It happened in America in the early 1929 crash, 1930s, an incompetent government and 14 million unemployed. And so before you get, everybody remembers the great political leaders and the ones who got you out of things, but they don't remember the ones who created the mess just before it, which made it easier to do something different. And I think that's Boris Johnson's job, is to do things so utterly terribly that it becomes possible to do things differently because you just have to. But that's just my feeling about Brexit at the moment and where we may be going to. But also, of course, the dealing with the pandemic. It's probably only about 10,000 people who died unnecessarily because he couldn't be bothered to attend those meetings. It's 10,000 people. Or Dominic Cummings. Yes, I can understand that Dominic could see the numbers because he was on the Sage Committee before all the rest of us can. And I can understand that if you're in London and you saw those numbers, you might try and get as far away from London as you could when it appears to be accelerating out of control, which is the point at which he fled to Durham. But at some point, people are going to put two together and say, why did he go to Durham? And the answer was because Durham was a very long way away from London. Why did he want to be a very long way away from London? Because he could see the numbers. What are the numbers he can see? Oh, here are the numbers. We now know what they are. Oh, look, they thought they could control this with herd immunity. And in a few days, they went from that to, oh my God, everybody's getting it, to society's falling down, so I'm going to get in the car and drive to Durham. And that's the person in charge of the civil service of the country. Quite happy to watch the capital self-destruct as long as he wasn't there. I don't know how long it's going to take people to put, it's obvious to me, you can come up with another reason why he went to Durham, but there's lots of other places he could have gone to. It's just that none of them were quite as far away from London. Oh, and had such a low rate of COVID-19 before a few people like him turned up.
Okay.
So, go on. Sorry to rant on about
No, I'm conscious of the time for your sake. It's
so I should go back to do my writing. Yes.
I'll go for two more. So I'm interested in what you think the political response to the pandemic is going to be. Do you think the age of austerity is over now?
It's tricky because I think we're going to become poorer. So it's quite hard to avoid austerity when you're poorer. The first austerity was after the Second World War, all the way through to at least 1952. And that was becoming poor. But people don't think of that period as an age of austerity. They think of the period 1945 to 52 as an age of amazing social revolution, the creation of the NHS, proper insurance, nationalising the mines, going to grammar schools for free, all kinds of things that happened. So we could have that kind of age of austerity where you don't know it's austerity. It's just that you're not flying to Spain every year anymore. But other things that are more important are happening. It's not what our politicians in charge want. It would be the most amazing turnaround in a human being for a set of people who want something for their entire life since they were teenagers, decided to be nice. It's not. I don't think it's going to happen with the current incumbents of government. I may be too old and cynical, and if it does happen, if liberal capitalism is over, if they actually do, I mean, you can't level up because the whole country cannot be as rich as Kensington. Right? I won't explain why, it's sort of obvious. But again, the fact you can have levelling up as a slogan and nobody goes, oh, come on, you can't all be as rich as Kensington, shows the kind of problems that Britain has got. I think we're going to have 2 or 3 truly, truly awful years. But part of those awful years will be good things happening, one of which should be the collapse of the housing market. Now, it's the housing market which best predicts whether people vote Conservative. As long as their house price stays up, they tend to vote Conservative. How on earth you can still sell 3-bedroom semis on the outskirts of poor parts of London for £600,000 or £700,000 when nobody, 6 million unemployed. And the government have got rid of stamp duty in a desperate attempt to make the housing market work. The reason they're getting people to put masks on is to try to get people shopping again. Masks, by the way, are a good idea, not for stopping the droplets. The good idea about masks is it helps people remember that we haven't gone back to normal. So they keep at least a metre away from somebody else. But anyway, that isn't why the government are doing it. It's not sensible reasons. But I'm optimistic for the medium term. I was just talking to somebody this morning about this and saying, this is like the Second World War, not as dramatic, not as big, but a similar kind of event. And if you think about my university, I'm in Oxford, around the time of the Second World War, and shortly after it, Evelyn Waugh published Brideshead Revisited, which begins about how everything had changed in the Second World War, writing about the extreme inequality of Britain in the 1920s, and Sebastian, the student who was incredibly rich and so on, and essentially just, it was wrong. And the question is, post-COVID, could you write about the extreme inequality of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, early 2010s, which in some ways were a return to the 1920s, and actually say, of course this is ridiculous, in a way that Brideshead Revisited did after the Second World War. And I think COVID makes that kind of thing more likely. In a way, the Black Lives Matters protest, that certainly the echo of it in Britain would not have happened or have been as strong without the lockdown. So you begin to think that different kinds of things are possible than were before, simply from what is actually happening. You can't sell university graduates the story we've been selling them. Work hard, or even not that hard, get a degree, get a starter job, get another job, eventually get a mortgage, you'll be okay. That was how we were keeping half the population subdued. And that story doesn't work. It really begins to fall apart. And these are the young people who did best at school. Once that doesn't work, are people going to be lethargic, sit back? How many years do you want to live in that bedroom that you were in as a child? What? Unnecessarily. So I think it is a change.
Okay, I'll finish with this one. I want to ask about this book here. So you and Sammy Tomlinson looked at imperial legacies still rooted in education, private school education, more specifically. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about the decolonizing of curriculums, and in your own city, Cecil Rhodes was removed from Oriel College. So how do you think a decolonization of the curriculum would work? What would it look like? And how would they drive it forward?
Cecil Rhodes has still got to come down So that the governing body of Orwell have said that they're minded. It's tricky. I mean, the best model is Germany. Nearest model is Germany after 1945. And the fact that that shocks people, we just don't, in Britain, and particularly in England, we have no awareness just how many millions upon millions upon millions of deaths that we were complicit in. We have no idea about how many years of life in slavery people lived because of us, how much if you were going to pay reparations. Suppose you were going to pay them, not even the minimum wage. Suppose you're going to pay the lowest apprenticeship legal fee in Britain for somebody who'd been enslaved all their life because of the British to their descendants. And you can begin to work out the amount of money, and it's just astronomical. All we're taught about is, we ended the slave trade. not who put all the slaves in the Caribbean, or the fact that slavery funded the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. We're taught, no, that was our clever imagination. So just somebody's just sitting there, and he came up with a steam engine. No, nobody said, why Britain? What was it about Britain? No, it's the coal. That's why. Nothing about the rest of the empire. So Germany is your model for it. The place in Europe which has the longest experience for complete rewriting of history, which initially wasn't accepted. Most Germans rallied against what happened in the late 40s and 50s in Germany. So that's where I would look. It makes it all much more fun. I mean, it's much more interesting that the more real history is much better than learning the wives of Henry VIII. The amount of crap we had to put in the curriculum, the amount of boring Tudors and Stuarts. I don't know if I had to do years of Tudors and Stuarts. It's amazing. And currently Gove, I think Gove with geography, he made the only continent you could study was South America, because everywhere else the British had been in large numbers. So he didn't want people to know about that. So he picked South America as being the continent. This is recent, Michael Gove. Because otherwise you'd be talking about, because you can't hide it about India. So I don't think decolonizing isn't necessarily at all hard. Most academics are, well, younger academics in particular, younger than me. You meet the occasional ignoramus who's managed to go through an education system and hasn't got a clue. But in the social sciences and humanities, most academics younger than me are pretty aware of a more real history. It's just that they then get hired to teach Tudors and Stuarts in some cases. But it's also when people demand it. So in my department, geography department in Oxford, in the most recent audit the university produced, we're the only large department which doesn't have a single black student, undergraduate. Nevertheless, 100 of our undergraduates wrote an open letter asking for the curriculum to be decolonized in my department, and including a photograph of the face of every single writer on every reading list we'd given them. And you just looked at the photographs and it was fairly clear why they'd done that, because they were all white. And that's the white undergraduates doing geography, white and occasionally Asian, at Oxford, demanding decolonizing. And this is hardly the most radical set of undergraduates in the country, and if they're demanding it, again, I think that's the beginning of the card. But I'd be tempted to not to use the word decolonizing so much and just say more truthful or less stupid. It must be mean about the word stupid, but decolonizing makes it suggest that like there are lots of alternative versions possible. And you can choose, I'd like to have a colonized history, please. I'll have a decolonized one. Just a slightly more eyes open history would be better. I don't think it's hard. One interesting thing, though, just to end on this, it's worth thinking ahead as to what will happen next. Because the biggest group of writers we don't include in our reading lists are not actually black. they're Chinese. And we're often not aware of our implicit bias against Chinese scholars. But 1.4 billion people, incredible civilization. In terms of geography, there's Chinese geography long before any geography in the West. And at some point, somebody's going to point out, oh yes, okay, some of your writers are black, but have you noticed not a single reference to anybody who's Chinese? So I think it's just worth trying to think ahead a little bit rather than having to go through these things again and again and again.